The smell of chicory coffee always brings it back. Not the good stuff we had in the senior common room, rich and dark, but the thin, bitter sludge of rationing. It smells like wet stone and fear. I am sitting in that room in Limoges again, or at least the version of it that my mind has decided to keep. They say memory is a library, but mine feels more like a burnt-out archive. The edges are charred. I can't be sure if the wallpaper was peeling blue or gray, but I know the dampness. It sat in the lungs like a heavy coin, a constant reminder of the cellar we were buried in. I was 21, but I felt ancient, and yet entirely like a child playing dress-up. Just months before, the most pressing danger I faced was a scathing critique from Professor Higgins on my translation of Goethe. Cambridge. God, it seems like a hallucination now. The smell of cut grass in May, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams of the university library, the soft, reverent hush of turning a page. We debated freedom there. We sat in plush leather armchairs and dissected tyranny as if it were a frog in a biology lab, something to be studied, categorized, and filed away. We thought we understood the mechanism of evil because we had read about it in books. We believed that logic was a shield, that if you could just articulate the moral superiority of democracy, the tanks would stop rolling. I looked at my hands in the dim light of the safe house. They were the same hands that had held a fountain pen, staining the tips with ink while I wrote essays on the moral imperatives of liberty. No, they were trembling. Just a slight vibration, like a tuning fork struck against a knee. It wasn't the dying that frightened me. I need you to understand that. We were all ready to die, or we told ourselves we were. My terror was specific, academic, precise. It was the fear of an error, a misplaced verb in a conversation, a forgotten street name, a hesitation that lasted a fraction of a second too long. In Cambridge, a mistake meant a lower mark. Here, it meant the baker down the street would be lined up against a wall and shot, and his wife would be sent east, and it would be my fault. My intellect, the very thing that had brought me here, felt fragile, like a glass shield against a sledgehammer. I asked myself constantly what right I had to be here. I was a student. I should have been punting on the cam, not orchestrating sabotage. The wireless set on the table hummed. It wasn't a sound so much as a pressure in the air, a high-frequency whine that drilled into the teeth. The operator, a boy whose name I have deliberately forgotten to protect him even now, watched me. The headphones crackled with the static of the atmosphere. I didn't hear dots and dashes. I heard the syntax of survival. I wrote the letters down. My pencil scratched against the rough paper. The ink blurred slightly. A drop of sweat had fallen from my nose onto the pad. It was ridiculous. I was sitting in a chair, perfectly still. Yet my body was reacting as if I were sprinting. This was the refusal, the internal scream that said, but the message was there. The logic was irrefutable. I had the languages. I had the memory. There was no one else. I stood up. The wooden chair scraped against the floorboards, a sound that seemed loud enough to wake the dead, though the operator didn't flinch. I went to the wardrobe and took out the coat. It was coarse wool, smelling of mothballs and stale smoke. I wasn't a leaner Vance, the promising linguistics student, anymore. I was Marie, a cousin from the country, dull-witted and harmless. I buttoned the coat. I checked my pockets, no English coins, no tram tickets from home, nothing that could betray the fiction. I walked to the door. The operator nodded once. Grim and silent, I turned the handle. The latch withdrew with a heavy, metallic finality. Outside, the rain was falling. It wasn't the romantic drizzle of an English spring. It was a cold, punishing sheet of water that blurred the world. I stepped out. The door sealed behind me, cutting off the smell of chicory, leaving me in the dark. The transition was physical, a blow to the chest. Inside, there was silence and the illusion of safety. Outside, the occupation was a living thing. Even at this hour, before the sun had fully risen, the city of Limoges groaned under the weight of it. The rain slicked the cobblestones, turning them into black mirrors that reflected the headlights of passing trucks. I kept my head down, shoulders hunched. This was the threshold. I had to leave the ivory tower and walk into the mud. My mind, usually a source of comfort, began to race. It catalogued the threats. This was my mentor now. Not a professor with a pipe, but the cold, hard database I had built in my skull. Every irregular verb, every colloquialism, every map coordinate, these were my weapons. I recited French nursery rhymes in my head to keep the rhythm of the accent perfect. The city grew louder as the morning broke. The market was waking up. It should have been a cheerful sound, the clatter of crates and the gossip of fishmongers. But the tone was wrong. It was frantic, brittle. People moved too fast. Eyes darted. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and unwashed bodies, a sharp, metallic tang that coated the back of the throat. I navigated the crowd, a ghost in someone else's coat. I reached the bakery. The bell above the door chimed, a bright, innocent sound that made my stomach turn over. The heat hit me first, the smell of yeast and flour momentarily masking the stench of the war. The baker was behind the counter, a large man with flour in the deep lines of his face. He was my contact, my ally. We had never spoken of anything real, only bread and weather, but he held my life in his hands. Une baguette s'il vous plaît, I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too high, too thin. Bien sûr, mademoiselle, he replied, reaching for a loaf. Then the door opened again. The bell chimed. The air pressure in the room changed. A uniform, black, the twin lightning bolts on the collar. An SS officer. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who had shaved closely that morning and smelled of expensive cologne. He stepped up beside me, ignoring my presence entirely, as one ignores a stray dog. 3 croissants, he ordered, his French accented but precise. I froze. This was the test. The logic of the debate hall dictated that I should leave, or act natural. But what is natural when a predator is standing 6 inches from your ribcage? I could feel the heat radiating from his wool coat. I forced myself to breathe. I focused on the crumbs on the counter. My mind screamed at me to run, but my intellect clamped down on the panic, holding it in a vice grip. The baker handed the officer the pastry bag. The officer threw coins on the counter, occupation currency, worthless paper, and turned on his heel. The leather of his boots creaked as he walked out. The bell chimed. He was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. The baker didn't look at me. He pretended to arrange the loaves, but I saw his hands shaking, dusting flour over the wood like snow. They took the circuit in Toul, he whispered, his lips barely moving. Yesterday, all of them, the firing squad. The words landed like stones. Toul was close, too close. The theoretical war, the one where the good guys eventually win because their cause is just, evaporated. This was the reality. People I might have known, people who had sat in rooms like mine and decoded messages, were dead. I have something for you, he said, sliding a wrapped loaf across the counter. It was heavier than bread should be. Intelligence. Maps of the depot. It has to go to St. Leonard. Today, by noon. I took the loaf. It felt warm like a living thing. I'll take the main road. I whispered. He looked up then and his eyes were hollow, stripped of hope. You can't, he said. The driver who brought the flour. He said they've set up checkpoints. Unexpected ones. Every bridge, every crossroads between here and St. Leonard is blocked by the Gestapo. They are tearing cars apart, searching everyone. I clutched the bread to my chest. The warmth seeped through my coat, but my blood ran cold. There was no other way to St. Leonard. The maps had to be delivered. The logic of the mission was absolute, but the variable had changed. The path was closed. The pedals of the bicycle squeaked beneath me. A rhythmic, rusty betrayal with every rotation. The air tasted of wet leaves and unburnt diesel. The bread in my basket bumped against the wicker, a dull, repetitive pressure against the handlebars. Inside that crust was the death of 100 men, or their salvation. I did not know which. I only knew the geometry of the road. A straight line to St. Leonard, and a black knot in the center of it. The checkpoint. It was not the Wehrmacht. It was not the tired, Gray-faced conscripts who just wanted a cigarette and a quiet shift. These were the wolves, the SS, the Gestapo. Their uniforms were impossibly black against the green of the French countryside, a void where the light simply ceased to exist. They were tearing a Citroën apart, ripping the upholstery with knives, tossing a family's suitcase into the ditch. I squeezed the brakes. The bike slowed. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Logic, Alina. Use your logic. If I turn around, they see a fleeing suspect. They shoot. If I go into the woods, I leave tracks. They hunt. If I stop, they question. They find the maps. There was no variable that equaled survival. The equation was unsolvable, unless I changed the terms. I watched the officer in charge. He was tall, thin, with a face like a blade. He shouted at a subordinate, striking him across the face with a glove. Arrogance, cruelty, bureaucracy. I knew that language. Not just the German words, I knew the syntax of their power. They respected only one thing: a greater force, a louder voice, a sharper cruelty. I did not slow down. I stood up on the pedals. I forced the blood into my face, not from exertion, but from a manufactured rage. I let the fear curdle into something acidic, something poisonous. I was not Alina Vance, the girl who studied poetry in Cambridge. I was not Marie, the baker's customer. I was the terrifying authority they worshipped. I skidded the bike to a halt inches from the officer's polished boots. Dust coated the shine. He turned, his hand dropping to the Luger at his belt, his eyes narrowing in shock. Before he could inhale, before he could form the question, I unleashed the weapon. I did not scream. Screaming is for the weak. I spoke in a low, vibrating hiss of pure, high academic German, the German of the universities, the German of the high command. I demanded to know why the road was blocked. I demanded to know why he, a competent officer presumably, was wasting time terrorizing peasants when the convoy from Berlin was delayed. I lied with the precision of a surgeon cutting out a tumor. I invented a fictional breakdown of a staff car 3 miles back. I invented a furious general waiting for reports that I, his personal attaché, was carrying. I pointed at the bread. I told him it was not food, but the incompetence of the local garrison manifested in a lack of supplies, which I had to rectify personally because his men were too busy ripping seats out of cars. I called him a bureaucratic stain on the Reich. I questioned his lineage. I questioned his grasp of the Führer's directives regarding efficiency. I saw the confusion cloud his eyes. He expected fear. He expected tears. He did not expect to be dressed down by a woman in a ragged coat who spoke his language better than he did. He looked at the bread. He looked at me. Your papers, he stammered, his hand wavering on the gun. I left. It was a cold, sharp sound. I told him that if he dared to delay me for a paper check while the general waited, I would ensure he was on the Eastern Front by sunrise. I leaned in, my face inches from his. I could smell his cologne, expensive and cloying. I stared into his pupils, and I saw the monster reflected there. It was not him. It was me. I was channeling a hate so pure, so authentic, that it terrified even me. I became the thing I despised to survive it. Move, I whispered. The silence stretched. The wind rustled the poplars. A crow called out. The officer stood frozen, caught between the regulation and the fear of a higher power. He looked at his men. They were watching. If he backed down, he looked weak. If he arrested me, and I was real, he was dead. He stepped back. He clicked his heels. A reflex, a machine responding to input. Proceed, he said. I did not look back. I did not hurry. I cycled past the barrier, past the open mouths of the soldiers, past the family weeping by their ruined car. I did not look at them. I could not. If I looked at them with compassion, the mask would slip. I had to look at them with contempt. I rode for 3 miles. The road was empty. The sun was high. My legs pumped the pedals, mechanical pistons driving a hollow shell. When the forest thickened, I turned off the road. I threw the bike into the undergrowth. I fell to my knees in the dirt. I did not cry. I retched. I dry heaved until my ribs ached, trying to expel the voice that had just come out of my throat. It was not just acting. That was the horror. It had been too easy. The cruelty, the arrogance, the disdain for human life. It had been sitting there inside me, waiting for the right key to turn the lock. I delivered the maps. The resistance used them to blow the depot 2 days later. The mission was a perfect success, a textbook operation. But the girl who cycled away from that checkpoint never made it back to Cambridge. I sit here now, in this quiet room. The tea is cold. The books on the shelves surround me. Plato, endless histories, treatises on ethics and morality. I used to believe in them. I used to believe that education was a ladder to something higher, that the mind was a temple of light. I was wrong. The mind is just a weapon, and like any weapon, it does not care whose hand holds it. I look at my degree on the wall, and all I see is a forgery. The logic I prized, the intellect I sharpened, it did not save me from the darkness. It allowed me to become the darkness. I learned that day that the line between a hero and a monster is not drawn in sand, but in circumstance. I crossed it. I walked in the skin of the enemy, and I found it fit me far too well. The harvest is ruined. You cannot plant seeds of truth in soil that has been poisoned by such necessary lies. I spent the rest of my life studying, reading, trying to find a philosophy that forgives what we did. But the pages are blank. The ink has run. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.